Our movie kicks off with a guy named Curtis who's staring up at the clouds, all confused because the rain coming down looks kind of weird. But then we find out it's just a dream. Curtis wakes up and everything's back to normal. Curtis is a dad, and he's got this sweet little family. His wife, Samantha, and their deaf daughter, Hannah. He has breakfast with them and then heads off to work at a construction company. Samantha, on the other hand, is this super skilled seamstress. She makes dresses and sells them every week. While Curtis is at work, Samantha is hanging out with some friends, laughing and taking care of the kids. But suddenly, she notices Hannah playing with a wooden plank full of nails. She panics and rushes over to stop her before she gets hurt. Meanwhile, Curtis is with his coworkers when it suddenly starts raining. The downpour forces them to stop working, so they decide to hit the bar for some beers. After their night out, Curtis drives his coworker Duarte home. Before Duarte heads inside, Curtis takes a moment. He can't help but envy the guy. Duarte seems to have the perfect life with his wife and daughter, but Curtis reminds him that people's lives aren't always as perfect as they look from the outside. Everyone has their own struggles. Right then, Duarte's wife storms out, yelling at him for coming home late and drunk. That's when Curtis realizes Duarte's life isn't as great as it seems. Curtis heads home, where Samantha greets him with love, but she also tells him that Hannah is still struggling to communicate with other kids. The next day, Curtis decides to clean up the house and the garage, getting rid of anything that could be dangerous for Hannah, like wood planks and nails. But while he's doing that, something strange happens. A massive storm starts forming in the sky. Lightning strikes the ground near their house. Curtis watches in shock as their dog starts acting weird, growling, restless, like he senses something's wrong. Then, out of nowhere, the dog snaps. It breaks free from its chain and lunges at Curtis, sinking its teeth deep into his arm. But once again, it was just a nightmare. One of Curtis's recurring, haunting dreams. He wakes up, shaken, feeling like something is seriously wrong with him. The moment he sees Hannah playing with the dog, a deep fear takes over. Without thinking, he pulls her away. Samantha starts noticing that Curtis hasn't been himself lately. When she asks him what's going on, he doesn't answer. Instead, he just leaves the house without even having breakfast. At work, Curtis is still stuck in his head, replaying the nightmare over and over. The pain from the dog bite felt so real, like it actually happened. But before he can think too much, his boss snaps him out of it, pushing the crew to finish their work on time. While working, Curtis notices something strange. A flock of birds moving erratically in the sky, almost like they're glitching. Even Duarte sees it, but he just shrugs it off. Later that day, Curtis heads to Hannah's school for a parent meeting about learning sign language. Since he doesn't spend as much time with her as Samantha does, he struggles to keep up. On the way home, a heavy storm hits. The rain is so intense that Curtis can barely see the road. Then, out of nowhere, he crashes. Blood drips down his forehead from the impact, but Hannah is safe. Before he can react, two men appear out of the darkness. One of them punches him, while the other grabs Hannah and runs. And just like that, another nightmare. Curtis wakes up screaming, completely drenched in sweat. His mind is unraveling, and Samantha knows it. She can see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of whatever is haunting him. But Curtis brushes it off, reassuring her that he's fine. He tells her to go to the craft fair with Hannah. He'll stay home. While they're gone, Curtis takes a roll of metal wire and builds a fence around the dog's area, locking it inside. Then, he heads to the underground storm shelter. And that's when we realize he's planning something. Something crazy. That night, Samantha confronts him about locking up the dog. But Curtis doesn't answer. His eyes are glued to the TV, watching the news. The next morning, Curtis sees Hannah standing by the window, watching the rain. But as he walks toward her, his eyes lock onto something, or someone outside. A strange man is standing in their yard. A deep fear grips Curtis as he watches the man suddenly lunge at their front door, trying to force it open. Then, the entire house starts shaking violently. Furniture lifts off the ground, flying through the air. Curtis is frozen, completely lost in the chaos. But we already know the truth. Just another nightmare. A nightmare so intense that Curtis wakes up in a cold sweat, his bed soaked. Samantha walks in to check on him, but he's not himself at all. When she tries to get closer, he snaps, yelling at her to back off. After she leaves, Curtis quickly strips the bed and throws the sheets in the wash, erasing the evidence. Later, he takes Hannah to the library, searching for any books on mental illness, trying to figure out what's happening to him. On the way home, he stops at a supermarket. But he doesn't just grab a few things. He loads up on canned food, a lot of it. Back home, Curtis heads straight to the underground storm shelter. He cleans it out and starts stocking it with all the food he just bought. That afternoon, he meets with a doctor. He talks about his insomnia, the exhaustion, how drained he feels. But to the doctor, it all sounds pretty normal. Just stress. That's when Curtis makes a decision. He tells him about the nightmares. The doctor looks at Curtis and says, "You need a psychiatrist." He refers him to a specialist in Columbus. Meanwhile, Samantha is at a medical clinic with Hannah, trying to figure out the cost of her surgery, the one that could help her hear again. That's when we learn something important. Curtis has a solid job with good insurance and it's going to cover the operation. That night, Curtis celebrates with his family. Hannah is finally getting her surgery, but there's one thing he doesn't tell them. He saw a doctor today, and when he takes his meds, he does it in the bathroom away from their eyes. The next morning, Curtis wakes up. No nightmares. For the first time in a long time, he actually feels okay. At work, he hears something, thunder rumbling in the sky, but when he asks Duarte about it, Duarte looks at him confused. He didn't hear a thing. A wave of anxiety hits Curtis. His stomach twists. He suddenly feels sick, violently sick. He can't hold it in. He starts throwing up and becomes too weak to keep working. He stumbles to his truck and drives off, but his chest gets tight. His breathing becomes shallow. A full-blown panic attack. He can't go any further. He pulls over, gasping for air. As soon as Curtis pulls over, he finds himself in front of a place that sells massive shipping containers. A sign, at least that's how it feels to him. Curtis decides to buy a steel container to expand the storm shelter and turn it into an impenetrable bunker. Later, he visits his mother. And that's when we realize she has a mental illness too. Paranoia, delusions. Curtis watches her and a terrifying thought creeps in. What if he's just like her? That fear pushes him to call the doctor again. He asks for another psychiatrist, someone closer. He knows now that he can't make it to Columbus. That night, he sits down and calculates the cost of building the bunker. It's a lot. So, the next morning, he goes to the bank and takes out a loan without telling Samantha. At work, he pulls Duarte aside and asks him for a favor. He needs help taking some equipment from the site to build the shelter. It's not exactly legal, but Duarte agrees. After work, Curtis visits a social worker. He tells her what's happening to him, but she's not a psychiatrist. There's nothing she can do except listen. So he talks. He tells her about his family, about his mother, who left him and his brother when they were kids because of her illness. That night, Curtis picks up Samantha and Hannah from their school meeting. As they're driving, lightning strikes the ground right in front of them. He stops the car, stunned. But when he looks around, no one else sees it. That's when he knows. The hallucinations are back. The next day, while Samantha and Hannah are out, Curtis and Duarte get to work. The bunker is finally coming together. But when Samantha returns, she sees what's happening, and she's furious. And then she finds out about the loan. Curtis stands there, silent. He doesn't argue. He doesn't even try to explain himself. Instead, he just walks away, goes inside, and doubles his medication dose. That night, Samantha wakes up to a horrifying sight. Curtis, next to her, convulsing, bleeding. She grabs the phone and calls for an ambulance, but the moment the paramedics arrive, Curtis gets up, completely fine. He reassures them that he's okay and eventually they leave. But once they're gone, he finally tells Samantha the truth. He's not okay. He opens up about the nightmares, about everything he's been hiding, and he makes her a promise. He'll see a psychiatrist. He won't let this consume him the way his mother's illness consumed her. The next day, they take Hannah to the hospital for a medical checkup. Her surgery is getting closer. At work, Curtis pulls his boss aside. He doesn't want Duarte on his crew anymore. Now that Curtis is in charge, he doesn't feel comfortable giving orders to his friend. Then, he apologizes for not pulling his weight lately, blaming it on Hannah's upcoming surgery. After work, Curtis makes another secret purchase. Gas masks. They're expensive, but to him, they're necessary. Meanwhile, Samantha meets up with Duarte's wife, who vents about her husband and tells Samantha to keep an eye on him. Samantha doesn't like that. She shuts it down, telling her that Curtis is fine, and she doesn't need advice from anyone. Days pass. Curtis is still working on the bunker when he gets an unexpected visitor, his brother. They sit and talk, and Curtis reassures him that everything is okay. But before his brother leaves, Curtis asks him for one thing: visit Mom more often. That night, the nightmares return. This time, Curtis dreams of a massive storm. Samantha is drowning in the flood, desperately reaching for a knife to stab him. The next day, Curtis gets hit with another surprise. His boss shows up at his house. He knows about the stolen equipment. Curtis is fired. When Samantha finds out, she loses it. She snaps, screaming at him, hitting him. Then she takes Hannah and walks out. She refuses to live with a man who's losing his mind. Desperate, Curtis goes back to the social worker. He just needs someone to talk to. But when he gets there, she's gone. Transferred. A stranger sits at her desk now. Curtis doesn't bother explaining everything from the beginning. He just turns around and leaves. Despite everything, he keeps working on the bunker, pushing to finish it as fast as possible. Meanwhile, Samantha is fighting her own battle, trying to save whatever money they have left before Curtis spends it all on his storm shelter. That night, Samantha sits down with Curtis. She begs him to see a psychiatrist. Then, she drops a bombshell. She's canceling Hannah's surgery until he finds another job. They just don't have the money anymore. But she makes him a promise. She'll stand by him. She'll help him through this, if he promises to get help. At the end of the week, Curtis and his family attend a school event. Everything seems fine, until Duarte shows up. He's still furious about losing his job, and he takes it out on Curtis, pushing him around in front of everyone. Curtis tries to de-escalate, but Duarte doesn't stop. So Curtis snaps. He kicks Duarte's leg, knocking him to the ground. Then he turns to the crowd and loses it. He screams at them, warning them about the storm. A massive storm is coming. No one is safe. Everyone stares. Nobody believes him. They see him for what he's become, a madman. Samantha rushes him home before things get worse. One day, Curtis sees Hannah standing in the middle of the road, staring up at the sky. He runs to her, but before he can reach her, a massive flock of birds swarms him. Then, just as suddenly, they drop. Dead. A siren blares in the distance. Curtis runs home. But then, he wakes up. Just another nightmare. Except this time, one thing is real. The siren. A powerful storm is hitting the town. Without thinking, Curtis grabs his family and rushes to the bunker. They slam the door shut, lock it tight, and put on their gas masks. The next morning, Samantha wakes Curtis. She tells him to open the door. The storm is over. But Curtis refuses. He still hears it. She doesn't. He hands her the key, silently asking her to do it instead. But she shakes her head. This is his fight. He has to open the door. Curtis hesitates. Then, finally, he unlocks it and steps outside. Everything is fine. People are out. The damage is minimal. The storm was nothing like he feared. Samantha takes Curtis to see a psychiatrist. The doctor tells them what they already know. Curtis needs time away. He needs real treatment. And that means going to a facility. Before that happens, Curtis takes his family to the beach. A small vacation. One last moment of peace. As they relax on the beach, Hannah picks up a stick and writes something in the sand. Storm. Curtis stares at the word, his heart pounding. Then, it happens. A massive storm starts forming over the ocean. The sky twists into something unnatural. The rain falls in thick, heavy sheets, just like in Curtis's dreams. At first, he thinks it's just him, that this is another hallucination. But then, Samantha looks at him. She sees it too, everything, and that's where we end our movie.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon.